Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So first off, I know it's been a while. I did not give up on doing this or making videos. It just actually took me this long to finish reading this book. And it's like a long-ish book. It's like 600 pages, but the length of the book is not really why it took me so long. I am in the middle of the most difficult semester of my life. I have never been so busy, so stressed, and I've also never had so little time to read, which is really weird for me and kind of difficult, but we're nearing the end-ish at this point. And that was going on before all of this other craziness happened, which when this started, I thought, well, at least the tiny little bright side is that I might be able to read a bit more, but I feel just as busy as I was before. You know, we're still in school, we're just doing it at home now, so. But anyways, I have been working on this book for a long time. This is Villette by Charlotte Bronte. So, this is probably a lesser known of the Bronte books. It's kind of my first one off the beaten path. I've read Jane Eyre more than once now, and I've read Wuthering Heights from her sister, and that's all I've read of the Brontes. So if you watched my Jane Eyre video, you know that I found it really, really bizarre. Wonderfully bizarre, but a very strange book. Feels really weird that pop culture kind of groups Charlotte Bronte in as like a romance writer when her novels feel like aromantic. Because Jane Eyre is just like weird and spooky, strange kind of novel. This is a weird one too. Definitely not disappointed in the level of weirdness in this one. So in this book, we're following this character, Lucy Snow, who's a character that doesn't have a lot of connections. She needs to work for her independence, which obviously is not the case for all women in this time period, right? So we see her childhood living with her godmother and a couple other kids that majorly come into play later in the book. We see her grow up, and then one day she just is like, I'm gonna get a boat ticket. She goes to France, stumbles into this place, this town, Villette, with no plan at all, no prospects, and just shows up and kind of stumbles into a school and becomes a teacher. It sounds crazy, but I think fate plays a really big role in this book. So this whole novel is in first person from Lucy's perspective, which feels strange. I feel like that wasn't the going style, or maybe it's just not what I expect from this time period, but that made it feel very modern. And it also made it strange and difficult in a lot of ways because Lucy is a very unreliable narrator. So Lucy, she has this sort of restlessness and this wildness in her, and this desire for freedom and independence. Obviously, she just left her home country pretty much on a whim, right? She does kind of crazy things like that sometimes. But all of those characteristics are very, very internal in her. We see it because we're in her head and we see her voice and her thoughts. But most of the other characters in the book think she's like this meek, mild, upright girl, except for one character, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, her style of writing, she does these like crazy, long, extended metaphors about like capital F faith and capital H hope and things like that that are really involved and kind of highlight that, you know, she's kind of dramatic in some ways, even though it's all very much inside. She seems to be outwardly very restrained, and I think she takes pride in the fact that no one around her knows what's going on inside of her head, really, that they all kind of have this misperception of her. And then there's sometimes when Lucy Snow just straight up lies to you, or at least lies by omission. So there's this thing in this book, and once I got to that point, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a crazy book. I have to hurry up and finish it. It's completely insane. But it's like 200 pages in, you've spent 100 pages with this character, Dr. John, who there's something kind of strange going on, but you don't really have any indication of what that is. And then, lo and behold, after like being around this character for like 100 pages, Lucy reveals that he was this boy Graham that she knew in her childhood, and that she knew all along and just didn't tell us, which is a crazy thing to do. That the whole chapter where all of this was revealed was so confusing, because she had like had a depressive episode and a fever, and she was wandering the streets, and she just like fell onto a doorstep, and someone took her to this house, and she woke up and she was like, this is all the furniture from that house I stayed in when I was a little kid. What is it doing in France? This is so weird. And they had brought all that furniture over, and it was this doctor and his mom were in this house, and it was the most confusing chapter. And like, I don't know, there are not very many Victorian writers where I put the book down and I'm like, what? But it happened so much in this book. So there are a lot of different characters moving in and around this book, and like every single one of them is flawed and imperfect, and it's hard to sort of make a judgment on whether or not you like a character, because we see them differently as Lucy's perspective on them shifts. So there are moments when you're okay with a character and you like them because Lucy almost convinces you to like them, and then there's some sort of a switch at some point. So there's Dr. John Graham Breton. So sometimes he seems kind of arrogant and a little cold towards Lucy. You know, that seems to be the case when they're children. And when they meet again, he doesn't recognize her immediately, so there's some coldness between them then. But then there are other moments where he's described as being very good and generous in a lot of ways. And by the end of the book, he is married to someone that brings the best out in him, according to Lucy. So I think we start out not liking Graham so much, and then he ends up in a good place as a character. So then we have Paulina. Everything I'm saying is probably like a huge spoiler for this book, but it's so old that I feel like it doesn't matter. But anyways, Paulina is a little girl that she knows in her childhood, and as a child she's kind of strange. She's like high-strung, and she's an odd little girl. But then she grows into this kind of perfect young woman in a lot of ways. And I feel like she's the only character in this book that Lucy kind of allows to be perfect. I mean, she has a lot of advantages in life that Lucy doesn't have. You know, she has the position in society, and she's also, you know, beautiful and charming and all those things that Lucy doesn't really have. But she also had some suffering early in her life, had some pretty major difficult things to deal with, and I think that gives her the seriousness that she needs to be kind of this perfect character, and she is the one who eventually brings out the best in Graham as her husband. So then another character, Jenever Fanshawe, we meet when Lucy is on the boat, initially traveling over to France. And at first you kind of like her. She's very confident, a very just naturally happy, self-involved kind of person. But you kind of like her. But then the more you get to know her, that kind of sours. She doesn't treat men very well. She has a brief thing with Dr. Breton where she kind of leads him on and isn't very nice to him. And then she runs away and elopes with some dumb guy, mostly because she's just jealous of Dr. Breton being married. So she ends up being largely harmless, but you don't like her as much at the end. And then another character that there's a pretty interesting 180 on is Madame Beck, who is the directress of the school and like Lucy's boss, basically. She is a strange character. She, like Lucy, keeps things very close to the chest, right? She doesn't outwardly show her feelings and her emotions a lot. And I think because of that, her and Lucy understand each other. So at first, even though Madame Beck's strange, she like searches through everybody's stuff when they're not around and like reads their letters and all of that. Lucy accepts it, so we kind of accept it too, and we feel this kind of mutual respect between those characters. But then by the end, it totally sours because Madame Beck shows her jealousy of a certain romantic situation that Lucy finds herself in, and she kind of goes out of her way to prevent this situation from happening. She interferes in their lives, and obviously, we don't like Madame Beck anymore after that. So then, a very important character, the one person who seems to catch on that Lucy has this wildness, this fierce independence inside of her, Monsieur Paul, who turns out in the latter half of the book to be her love interest. Which just, I mean, okay, after reading this and Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte must have really, really bad, problematic taste in men, because Monsieur Paul is terrible for most of the book. He's just this like high-strung, really bossy person, and he's just like yelling and raging, and he has this temper, so he's just always angry and freaking out, and he insults Lucy a lot. He insults her intelligence all the time. He talks about her dress and her behaviors like she's sinful in some way, even though everybody else kind of sees her as this meek thing. But, you know, in a way, he kind of sees through her outward calm a little bit, because there is something different about Lucy on the inside. But he is so mean and angry and yelling all the time. But then as Lucy develops this kind of friendship and relationship with him, we do see some better moments. We see him being really tender and apologizing and being generous. And we see more of his life outside of the school. You know, he had sort of a tragic love when he was younger who passed away. So we see all of these other things, and he gets complicated, and by the end he's much nicer and he's been changed for the better. But it seems so wild that even when he was just like raging and flaming and just being horrible all the time, Lucy would still be like, oh, there's something like genius about him, right? He is a very, very strange character. So there's a lot of strange circumstances in this novel. Like how I said, fate seems to play a big role, right? Lucy just sort of knocks on a random door, and it happens to be this school where she can work, right? And Madame Beck doesn't want to hire her until she gets Monsieur Paul to give approval. So as soon as she arrives, Monsieur Paul is like examining her and looking in her eyes and says, yes, bring her here, right? So those connections are really immediate. And then there's this whole group of the English people from Lucy's childhood. So Dr. Breton, Paulina, all of these people that she knew as a child, they all end up for different reasons in the same town and reconnecting, which is, you know, very unlikely. So you feel fate playing a hand in that. And then there's moments where Lucy does things and she doesn't really know why she does them. It's almost like there's some sort of exterior force or a vision pulling her to go somewhere and be somewhere at a certain time. And that kind of moves part of the plot. So that also seems like a fate thing in there. So yeah, it feels kind of lightly supernatural in those ways. And then there's a whole plot line that is explicitly supernatural in the ghost of a nun who they suppose to be Monsieur Paul's dead lover. So that was particularly wild, being like 200 pages into a novel that's strange but largely grounded in realism, and then for there to all of a sudden be a ghost in it who makes multiple appearances. And then they wrap up the ghost thing in the most unsatisfying way. Like, I would have rather she just stayed a ghost, but they made it like Jenever Fanshaw's suitor who had been sneaking into the school at night to visit her was dressing up as a nun so he wouldn't get caught, which was like a little disappointing. But there are some ghostly scenes in this one. And so I don't think you can talk about Villette without addressing the very end of this book. So, Monsieur Paul has essentially been manipulated by all of his connections to go to the West Indies, where one of his connections has some property so he can manage it for a few years, make them some money, and then come back. So he's going to be gone for 3 years. There's all this drama and build-up around him leaving, but in the end, him and Lucy reach an understanding. They express their love for each other. They plan to marry when he gets back from the West Indies. And before he goes, he sort of fulfills Lucy's dream that she's been holding on to, which is to start her own school, be her own directress, and she's been saving money for a really long time to find a place, and it's her dream to sort of be independent, free, you know, not having anybody looking over her shoulder. And you can tell that this idea of freedom is really important to Lucy. She brings it up a lot. And even with being in love, she sort of makes that contrast between you're either free or you're in love, right? So we get a sense of Lucy's mindset going into this. But she's really happy running the school when he's in the West Indies. You know, she's anticipating his return, she's having some success, and she's enjoying that freedom. And then on the very last page of this book, I'm pretty sure Monsieur Paul dies in the boat on the way back. I say pretty sure because Charlotte Bronte left it a little vague, and yes, she did that intentionally because she has said that before. But yeah, so all of this build up, and then we kind of think, okay, we're on the last page, just sort of wrapping things up, tying the bow off of this story. That happens. And then it's doubly strange because it almost makes a grim kind of sense, right? Because Lucy seems to feel she can't be in love and be free, right? So maybe you get the sense that if he had made it back, it wouldn't have ended well. It wouldn't have ended with them happy. And now she's alone and she has this disappointment that she's not going to have this love in her life, right? But she gets her freedom, she gets her independence in this time period. That's a rare thing for a woman. So yeah, it's kind of her career kind of takes the forefront of this novel, which I think is very interesting and strange for Victorian era. So yeah, there's this kind of grimness in the book and this sort of statement that life is unfair, right? Lucy has all of these near misses and she never seems to be in a place where she can have it all, you know? Something else interesting about this book that I want to point out is that I feel like it gives a really good narrative description of depression, which very interesting for this time period to have mental illness in here and for it to be really clear, even if they didn't have the words and the research and the science behind it yet at this point. Because we see Lucy, she's very isolated. So we sort of get hints that she's not completely okay a lot of the time, right? Even though there are several instances where she's trying to convince us as readers that, oh, I'm fine. But you can tell that she's not, right? Because she has that like unreliable thing to her. And about halfway through the book and then towards the end of the book, she has these major depressive episodes that sort of play out to the point where they make her ill, right? Probably because when she's in these depressive episodes, she's not like eating and things like that, right? So it's interesting to see that in the context of something from the Victorian era, right? Like mental illness always existed even before we understood it. Yeah, Lucy Snow is such a surprisingly complicated character, right? I find it really hard to pin her down, to totally figure out who she is, which makes for a really interesting novel. I could see Charlotte Bronte's contemporaries not loving this novel. I think there was a little bit of controversy around it, thinking that this wasn't as good in some ways, because it's kind of wild, it's kind of all over the place because of this narrator. And, you know, she doesn't end up married, right? She ends up independent with a career, with a life ahead of her that does not involve love, right? Not super typical for female characters in novels right now. And Lucy is rebellious and wild inside of herself, and she is complicated, and there are no easy answers, and there's no easy ending, which I think for people of her own time period, this novel might have rubbed them the wrong way. So overall, a great, long, winding, twisting book. It was really interesting. I had a lot of shocks and surprises, which several of them I have given away in the video if you have not read this yet. But it's really interesting, and it makes me want to go farther into, you know, the Bronte books in general than I have before. So, you know, if you like Jane Eyre, if you like those kind of things, I think Villette's really interesting. And I feel like you learn a lot about Charlotte as well. They say that this is sort of the closest to autobiographical of her works. So, I don't know, you get a peek inside of her mind and who she is, and it's really interesting. Okay, well, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching.